Hello, it's great to be here with you again today. I'm Dr. Sandra Affenito, President and CEO of the American Association of University Administrators. AAUA is a nonprofit professional organization for higher education leaders and administrative personnel. It is the only professional organization for individuals interested in the entire range of higher education administration, from entry level to president, across the diverse set of American colleges and universities. This is another exciting episode in our 2026 podcast series in which we speak to leaders across the country about current issues facing higher education based on the themes of our conference, our AAUA annual meeting, October 19 through 20 at Cleveland State University. Realizing the higher education value proposition is why we are coming together. Joining us today is Dr. Timothy M. Renick, Executive Director, National Institute for Student Success at Georgia State University. Named among the world's 50 greatest leaders by Fortune magazine, Dr. Renick's work, Tim, who is with us today, has been covered by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time, CNN, and cited by former President Barack Obama. Between 2008 until 2020, he directed the student success efforts of the university, overseeing a 70% improvement in graduation rates and the elimination of all equity gaps based on students' race, ethnicity, or income level. Tim has testified on strategies for helping university students succeed before both the U.S. Senate and House. As principal investigator for over $80 million in grants, Dr. Renick's transformational work has focused on promoting better and more equitable outcomes for college students. Thank you, Tim, for your long-standing dedication to student success. This is truly remarkable. Now I would like to turn the microphone over to Matt Roche, AAUA board member and chair of our conference committee, who will be moderating this conversation. Here you go, Matt.
Thank you, Sandra. Tim, I echo President Affenito's sentiments and I'm equally grateful to have you joining us today. Our focus today will be on the future of higher education related directly to student success and will hopefully serve as a teaser to your keynote presentation at our annual conference on October 19th, which we are extremely excited for. To start off, can you just give us a broad introduction to the National Institute for Student Success, what it is, whom you serve, and how you partner with institutions across the country to address retention and completion challenges?
Sure, Matt. Thank you for having me today. It's an honor. The National Institute for Student Success, which I will refer to for short as the NISS, has been in existence now for about 5 years. We're a nonprofit consulting and research institute within Georgia State University, but we're entirely out-facing. So I have a staff of about 50 full-time employees. We do nothing but work with other institutions, largely administrators, to help them improve the student support systems that touch every student, in some cases every day. We're talking about registration platforms, advising, financial aid, academic course design and program design and so forth. The NISS focuses on these big issues for two main reasons. One, they're in the control of our campuses. There are some reasons students drop out that are perhaps not primarily in our control and don't fit our mission. The NISS really focuses on institutions doing their core mission more effectively using evidence-based practices. The other reason we emphasize these systems is because if you can improve these systems, they end up helping not just a couple students or even a couple hundred students. They end up helping all of your students because all of the students are impacted by these systems on a day-to-day basis. So we're currently working with over 170 institutions nationally across 31 states. We're working with 11 state systems as well. And I will say that the early results are extremely encouraging, not surprising, because these are evidence-based practices. We're helping institutions be more coordinated and more systematic and more proactive in the way they support students. If you do that, then I can almost guarantee you're going to see stronger student outcomes and more equitable outcomes as well. And what I will say is, in our first now 4 years of true operations delivering our services, our clients' graduation rates are going up by about 2.5 times the national average. And we're seeing a closing of attainment gaps at our partner institutions. We're seeing increased enrollments. And, just one aspect of the value proposition of higher education is evidenced by the fact that if you hold on to more students, you also hold on to more revenues. And so we're also seeing increased revenues at our partner campuses as well.
That is awesome. Thank you for that background. And I'm happy to say that I'm at an institution that proudly partners with NISS. I believe we just finished our second year. Right when I started, one of the first things I got to do was listen to Tim's presentation to our campus of our initial kickoff survey. And the amount of detail is just so impressive. So I'm not surprised to see the amount of success that you guys are having. And I'm looking forward to our continued work together at Cleveland State. Now I want to kind of jump into specifics of Georgia State. I know you're Hauser, but you're an independent nonprofit. But the work that you did really laid the foundation for what has been happening at Georgia State and continues to today. And so the impacts that you've had, as Sandra mentioned, you've seen roughly a 70% increase in graduation rates and closed key equity gaps through some of this work. How should institutional leaders think about completion rates as part of the broader return on investment conversation within higher education?
Yeah, it's a really important question, especially at this moment where in so many states, demographics are not in the favor of increased enrollment. We're working with some states in Michigan, Maine, New Hampshire, where over the last decade, number of college-going students, at least those coming out of high school, is down by 30% or so. Wow. So we really do need to think about the value proposition. What I'll say about my own journey is I am a humanities professor to start with. I chaired the Department of Religious Studies at Georgia State. I was the director of the honors program. I fell into the student success work in part because I saw day to day how, in many ways, devastating our failing bureaucratic and administrative systems at Georgia State could be. We in the religious studies program, I got to know the students very well because we're a small department. We would send students off to Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Princeton to graduate programs. We would see equally talented students who didn't even graduate from college. They lasted a couple semesters and were gone. And in many cases, it was because of our own administrative systems. They failed to get a paper in on time to the financial aid office. They didn't register for the right classes. They got bogged down by some high DFW rate course that, is a killer course for many first-year students. And so when I was asked to lead the student success efforts at Georgia State, it was really for a twofold process. My field in religion is religious ethics, and there is a moral imperative to serve the students well. Yeah. But there's also an institutional wellness issue at stake here, because at the time, Georgia State was losing about, almost 65% of the students who started with us. We were losing not only those opportunities to help these students transform their lives, we were losing their revenues as well. And at a time where state budgets were being cut and appropriations were being lost, that is not a winning formula. So one of the leading messages I put forward, and in the keynote, I'll talk about this in some detail, is that student success work done well is not only the morally right thing to do, it's the fiscally prudent and responsible thing to do for institutions. If you're in Maine or Michigan, or for that matter in Georgia, where right now our high school age population is declining, you're not going to hold on to your enrollments by out recruiting your neighbor. At least 95% of us in higher ed are not going to do so. You're going to be able to hold on to the revenues that keep your institution solvent and maybe even grow those revenues by doing student success work well. At Georgia State, over the decade from when we launched our initiatives to the close of that decade, we're graduating 3,500 more students every year. What does that translate to in additional tuition and fee revenues? About $80 million a year in tuition and fee revenues that we're holding on to now that in the past we're walking away. We work with Boston Consulting Group to look at the ROI. How much did we invest in order to produce those additional revenues? And the ratio that we've come up with again and again is roughly 8 to 10 to 1. You bring in about 8 to 10 times more dollars than it costs you to make these oftentimes fairly low cost and intuitive changes to these administrative structures and services.
Yeah, I love that. I think one thing that coming from a student affairs world that I've noticed is a lot of the time it's just the processes and how hard it is to navigate different systems and not having set ownerships of different processes on our campus. It also reminds me of a former president I had, and I think you just said this way more eloquently, but he would always say it's cheaper to retain students than to recruit new ones consistently. And so I think what you're saying makes a ton of sense, and I'm on board with that.
Yeah, and I will say on that, Matt, and the equation has gotten more dramatic. Years ago, when in many cases there was fastly growing, especially young populations in states and so forth, it was still true that it was less expensive to hold on to students than recruit new ones. And now the equation is even more in favor of putting some energy, time, and thought into what you can do to hold on to the students you have.
So I want to jump into one thing that has stood out most to me, especially surrounding Georgia State. You, like me in Ohio, are operating in difficult regulatory environments at times, especially surrounded equity and DEI. And so one of the things that stood out to me is that as you've been doing this work at Georgia State, you've been able to drastically reduce the achievement gaps across race, ethnicity, and income. What have you learned about advancing equity-minded student success when DEI is under political or regulatory pressure?
Yeah, it's a great question. Georgia State has a couple distinctions. One very proud of is the fact that for about 7 or 8 years now, we've conferred more degrees to Black students than any other school in the United States. And that was not the case before we launched these initiatives. In fact, back in 2005, 2008, our graduation rates for Black students hovered around 25%. So we've been able to transform success rates for low-income students, for first-generation students from minoritized backgrounds. And we've done it in a context in the state of Georgia, which has not been particularly receptive to DEI as such. In some ways, that's been helpful in retrospect because we haven't had to pivot in the same way that some states and universities have done over the last year or two. We developed our programs at Georgia State under a context, for instance, where we could not distribute any scholarships based on a student's race or ethnicity. We've never been allowed to do that, at least in my administrative career within the state of Georgia. So what it forced us to do was really think about what are these issues that we do have control over. Well, we don't, and what are these issues that are impacting the students on a day-to-day basis? I think the biggest single lesson from Georgia State is that, quite frankly, as administrators, we're more complicit in the struggle of our students than we perhaps have admitted in the past. Because Georgia State has not been able to change our incoming admission standards over this period. In fact, our incoming SAT and ACT scores are gone. We haven't been able to secure more state appropriations. In fact, our state appropriations are down over this time period. And because we haven't been able to use a lot of DEI approaches, it's almost an elegant testing ground for how much of a movement can you make in student outcomes and how far can you go in reducing attainment gaps if you really concentrate on the general systems that are in the control of every institution and that are not specific to one racial or ethnic group over another. And the answer is pretty resounding. And it's not just that Georgia State has these examples. I think some of you know that we've been very active in publishing independent evaluations of our work. We've now produced at least a dozen or more RCTs, randomized control trials over this time period, longitudinal studies, independent evaluations, and so forth. What it shows is very striking, that yes, DEI may be effective as a way of closing attainment gaps. I don't want to refute that. But I will say to all of you working in circumstances where those pathways are no longer viable, there's another way in which you can make extremely significant inroads in reducing attainment gaps. And that's through getting your basic core systems working better. We underestimate how many students, especially from low income, minoritized background, leave our institutions because they can't navigate our admissions processes. They get overwhelmed by the pre-enrollment bureaucracy. They can't figure out the registration system, or if they do, they can't get the courses they need when they need their courses. Their financial aid is vulnerable and confusing and overwhelming. Their scholarships are timed for 4 years, even though if you're a working student, you almost definitely take more than 4 years to complete your degree. They face essential first-year classes in many instances with DFW rates, I kid you not, of 100%. We've now worked with 170 institutions. I'd say at least a third of them, when we look at their first-year data, have sections of courses where every single student has failed to get a passing grade in the course. And we're sitting by and doing nothing. I think the important thing to say is many of these issues are not on the day-to-day radar screen of most university leaders. They don't know. When we do all our findings, as you know, Matt, to the president and the provost, the cabinet, after the first 6 months, we want them, by contract, we require them to sit down and hear what we found. I don't know a single president who had any clue that their institution was offering first-year classes where students were regularly failing, at least in sections of these courses, at a 75, 80, even 100% clip. So this is totally off the radar screen. So, I think this has been the core lesson of Georgia State, that while we haven't had the ability, and we certainly don't today have the ability to do what is typically categorized as DEI, you can make huge inroads in creating more equitable outcomes for your students by getting your systems working well. And quite frankly, it not only benefits your low income and minoritized students, it benefits all of your students. We don't have a single group at Georgia State demographically that's not doing much better. And in Georgia, we have lots of rural poor whites who are benefiting from these supports. A couple years ago, Georgia State was named the #1 military-friendly institution in the country. And we were great. What a great honor. We're pleased by this and so forth. When we looked at the details of what we had done to deserve a designation as the most military-friendly institution in the country, turned out it wasn't what we were specifically doing for our military learners. Of course, we do have an office that helps them with their benefits and all that sort of thing. It was all the things we do for all of our students on a day-to-day basis. Proactive outreach, tracking students with predictive analytics, grant programs where the students don't have to apply. We're using data to identify the students in need and just reaching out and giving them the grants that they need to support. Near peer tutoring, systems that are available 24/7, the use of AI technology to answer questions after hours. These were the things that made us military friendly, but they're also the things we're doing for every single one of our students on a day-to-day basis.
That is fantastic. It's a different way that, coming from a DEI background, that I've heard that explained. I think the agility that you've shown and focus on process improvement and streamlining and getting your systems in place is something that anyone can take back to their university and improve their retention, improve DEI practices without even doing it, because again, it impacts everyone. And so the one thing that was most interesting in that for me, though, is talking about how it's been a little easier because it's always been the regulatory environment that you've been in, whereas a lot of states are seeing drastic shifts. And the amount of time in Ohio, for instance, we have Senate Bill 1, that hundreds and hundreds of hours of transitioning policies, of transitioning offices and types of work. So I actually understand that, but never thought of it that way, that it's easier because you already know your circumstances and just having to work within them and find ways through. So I appreciate that perspective a lot. All right, I wanted to kind of jump ahead to change management, because I think this is where institutions tend to struggle. A lot of institutions know changes need to be made. They know that there's improvements we can make to our support systems, to how we're doing retention. but whether it be the culture of the institution, the capacity of the staff that we've talked about, there's difficulties. So we know what to do, but we can't implement the how always. So from what you've seen in your research across the different institutions you've worked with, what differentiates campuses that have successfully implemented student success innovations from those that just stall out in the process of trying to make those changes?
Yeah, it's a big question, and there are a lot of lessons we've learned, especially since over the last 5 years we've been working with so many other institutions. I'll mention kind of one pivot we had to make about 6 months into our operations at the NISS. I mentioned earlier that for all of our partner campuses, we now require that the president convene the cabinet and schedule a 90-minute meeting where they have to sit there and hear the findings from our diagnostic of what is working and what's not with their administrative systems. That's actually a new feature, because in our earliest operations at the NISS, we found that we were finding things that needed to be changed, but the president was not in the room, and the very siloed nature that in some ways was the very root cause of the problem that we had identified couldn't be overcome by just telling these second tier or third tier administrators about the problem that we identified. We now actually have a set of specific recommendations just for the president. This is what we need you to do. If you're moving towards more proactive advising and using data and so forth, we don't need the president. It's great if they do to understand predictive analytics or know how to implement a CRM and so forth. That's not necessary. What we need the president to do is convene a cross-functional group of advising leaders and empower them to decide on an advising system, decide on a standard of care, and require training of advisors on a semester by semester basis, or you fill in the blanks. That's what we need the president to do. So one thing the NISS now does is not only require our partner presidents to be present and listen, but actually to do some things. And I can't count the number of times that even some long-term presidents, they've been in their role 10 years, say to me after getting those recommendations, nobody ever said to me what I need to do in order to, for us to take this next step. And all the people on the sidelines, sometimes, a little nervous to even mention to the president, have been waiting for somebody to make the decision and say, this is what we need to do and go forward. So that's one thing, is you need the different levels of leadership to be engaged and involved. And it doesn't work unless you have both the practitioners and the leadership from the top. The second and other thing I will say is that one of the reasons I'm known to be a data person is because I'm a firm believer that in our environment in higher education, data is disproportionately important, that we are working with a challenging audience on a day-to-day basis. If you're trying to do change, you're trying to change the minds of really smart people who have lots of degrees and letters after their name and who are pretty darn sure that they know exactly what works and what doesn't in higher education. And so how do you get that group of individuals to change their mind? It's by presenting data. In some cases, it's only by presenting data. There are some interventions we suggest to our clients is just give the faculty and chairs this data and stand back because they haven't seen it before. They're smart people. Let them kind of hash out what it means. One example I mentioned briefly earlier is the fact that there are some courses where even in a given semester, multiple sections have very different outcomes for students. The DFW rates in some of the sections being as low as 0%, other sections 70, 80, 90%. You don't want as administrator to be in the middle of that discussion necessarily, but I can say that what the NISS can help do and what all of you can do is set up a structure every month. The associate deans and the chairs get these data. And once a quarter, they're going to meet and then report up to the Senate or the cabinet or whoever you decide on what they're finding and what they recommend be done about it. And that will begin to get changed. But I do think data is the common language. And while it's not 100% effective, if you put meaningful data in front of even skeptical individuals in higher education, they are trained to use it. They are trained to pay attention to it. Not all will, not all do, but at least that's a really important starting point. And it's why our whole process at the NISS begins with 6 months of data, a diagnostic process.
Yeah. And Tim, I'll just add, and Matt, if I could, um, you know, engaging faculty, staff across the board, cross-functional units to gather some of these data, right? Because they're working with students, and it's not only the quantitative, it's the qualitative. Again, a holistic approach. So when they are involved in teams and gathering the data, we've run teams in the institutions I've served respectfully, and I will tell you, it does truly make a difference. So I'm with you on all of this.
I agree. I've got a data point to support that, which is we track very carefully the outcomes of our client campuses. And we've seen across the campuses working with the NISS that some of the improvements begin before we even launch into the implementation work. And it's affirmation of what you're saying. By getting these teams together and talking about and looking at the data, they'll already begin to say, oh, now I see something I didn't see before, and now I can address it in a way I couldn't before. So, at times we don't have to be too forceful in guiding the conversation. At times with these really smart people, it's enough to just give them the information that they didn't have in the past and let them run with it. There are other times, and we've talked about a couple instances, where we do, as administrators, need to take a much more forceful role.
All right, as we head into our last question, I just want to say that it is interesting to me, but also not surprising at the same time, that we've had 3 very different focuses as we launched this podcast, 3 different backgrounds. And the 2 main themes of the skeptical individuals on our campus as change is happening, and then also breaking down silos, has come through in every single conversation. And so I think no matter what part of the institution we're working in, those themes seem to carry through in our challenges that we all see on a daily basis. I think data is an answer to fixing those. And if you get the data in front of those individuals, you can change the narrative, you could change the conversation. And so Sandra teed me up perfectly for this last question. As mentioned, we've been focusing on storytelling and changing the narrative a little bit. And so how can leaders, and this is going to take you out of your comfort level a little, Tim, how can we use narrative, not just dashboards and data, to help our campus communities understand and own our student success agenda?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not out of my comfort zone in meaningful ways. I'm a liberal arts student, a humanities student from Dartmouth, and then I did my graduate work at Princeton and so forth in religious studies. I'll say that there was kind of a turn in our impact at Georgia State. That a lot of it, was hard work getting the data right and implementing programs and so forth. Some of it was telling a story that our campus bought into and then others bought into nationally, funders and so forth. There was a pivotal moment. And, it kind of went like this, and it came about over the course of a number of years. It wasn't full formed at the beginning. I'm sitting here today, out the back there is Auburn Avenue in downtown Atlanta. For those of you who don't know, Auburn Avenue was really the cradle of the civil rights movement in the U.S. I'm about 5 blocks away from Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the Reverend King was head pastor. His gravesite is right here in downtown Atlanta, right off Auburn Avenue. His childhood home, he was born right here. Every morning I drive by the middle school Martin Luther King attended. And, Georgia State was the institution that was linked to this geography, right? Auburn Avenue cuts our campus right in half. But into the 1960s, we were segregated. When Martin Luther King was doing his civil rights work, Georgia State was whites only.
Wow.
What a sad irony that is. You've got this great world leader in civil rights, and here's this big institution a couple blocks away that's the embodiment of everything he's fighting against. And, Georgia State really had a long struggle to overcome that legacy long after desegregation was ended. I mentioned this earlier. Our graduation rates for our Black students as of 20 or so years ago was around 25%, huge attainment gaps between Black and white students. For African-American males, it was around 20%. So, yeah, we were admitting Black students. We were desegregated in a sense, but we were still a part of the problem. And, now Georgia State has equitable graduation rates. They're 70% higher across the board, but the gains have been greater for our Black students. Our graduation rates for our African-American males have more than doubled. I mentioned that we're now graduating with bachelor's degrees more Black and African-American students than any other school in the country. So if that's not a narrative that shows the possibility about what we can do as administrators and leaders at our institution to change our own behaviors, because we didn't change the students, we didn't raise admissions requirements, we didn't unfortunately get to distribute a lot more scholarship dollars and so forth. We did this largely by recognizing that we are part of the problem, and we also, as a result of that, can be part of the solution. So, I think the narrative is extremely important, and that I would, as I go to campuses, I encourage the student success team and the presidents to not only become accustomed with the data and where they stand and so forth, but also be able to tell the story about why this transformation is not only important, but why it's possible if enough people buy in and support it.
Wow, I'm just so inspired, just so thought-provoking. This has been an amazing conversation. And so let me just wrap it up for us. At AAUA, we definitely pride ourselves on envisioning the future of higher ed, as you've just talked about in our time together, and helping to build our leaders, our leaders of tomorrow, and their capacity right now to make the changes, those necessary changes for long-term, I'll say, effectiveness, institutional, but certainly the effectiveness of our educational systems. So, Tim, to wrap it up, what is your vision for the future of higher ed, and how do you go forward with our institutions and lead those conversations necessary for the change so that our institutions truly realize their full potential?
Yeah, I'm an optimist. I wouldn't be dedicating this part of my career to directing the National Institute for Student Success if I were not an optimist. I think that the last decade has provided us with, as academic leaders, with opportunities that didn't exist a decade ago. Predictive analytics, CRMs, big data, AI. Yeah, these can be daunting and they can pose threats and challenges, but they can also help us better serve our students by delivering more personalized attention to students at scale. So there are lots of things changing. AI is, creating havoc with some of our long-term planning, and certainly changing how we might think about the job market in ways that maybe we can't even predict. But I will say that one thing that isn't changing is the fact that education at its core requires that we support students on a personalized and proactive and individualized basis on day to day. I think we would all admit, and I'd be the first to admit, Georgia State for much of our history didn't do that very well, right? We've had big bureaucracy, we've had low investment in these services and so forth. So I'm an optimist because I think we're at a time when we can begin to leverage these supports to really serve our students well. We've shown in the business world that we can use all these techniques, the disaggregating of data to personalize and target messaging, to sell people all kinds of things, some of which they probably don't need and much of which we know they can't afford. Well, if we can use these techniques for that purpose, why don't we use them for a moral purpose of helping students gain a brighter future, fulfill their goals, helping our communities be stronger, helping our workforce grow and be more responsive and flexible and so forth. So, that's how I would message the years ahead. There could be some dark times, but if we get together and really rally our colleagues to recognize that we can make our institutions so much stronger and so much more effective in serving our students, then we can help shape what that future will be.
Yeah, so well said, Tim. Modernizing the systems. I mean, this is higher ed. This is what we're all about. Think about when online learning just began, the kind of conversations that were happening. And today it has just opened up accessibility, affordability, meeting the students where they are. So I see going forward a future that's bright, filled with great promise, and utilizing those tools to supplement the holistic, customized experience for the student. That's high touch. So in terms of having that personalized attention and all the work that you and your teams have done, not only there, but across so many colleges and universities. We're fortunate to have your leadership. So I do thank you, and certainly all of AAUA. I'm inspired, encouraged by the work that you do at NISS, putting our student experience and student success at the forefront of a higher education aligns perfectly with the mission of AAUA and our personal ethos. So thank you, Tim. I'm going to turn it over to Matt to kind of wind us down officially about our conference a little bit. But from the bottom of my heart, I'm grateful for your time today and your thoughtful conversation. Go ahead, Matt.
Yes, Tim, I want to thank you as well. Thank you for the thought-provoking discussion. We are very much looking forward to having you as our keynote speaker at our upcoming conference. Tim is scheduled to speak, for those that are interested in joining us, October 19th at 3:30 p.m. at my home institution, Cleveland State University. During this discussion, we plan to dive a bit deeper into how student success plays a pivotal role in the discussion on the value of higher education. So Tim, thank you again for being a leader in this field and for continuing to innovate in this space responsibly using data.
Yeah. And Matt, I thank you as well for leading the conversation. For our listeners today who are out there, if you'd like to learn more about our wonderful organization, very mission-driven and focused, please join us. Go to our website, www.aaua.org. I'd love to hear from you personally. Sandra.Affenito at AAUA.org. And thank you for being with us today. And certainly, I hope to see some of you at our conference, as Matt mentioned. And please be well, especially in the spirit of the mission and student success. So thank you again.